Hello, I'm back again, and this is the second part of the interview that Al from the Al show did with Frank Morales in on September 28, 2005, and they're discussing, dispersal of populations, counterinsurgency, gentrification, etc., federal emergency management around the era of the Katrina disaster. So. Yeah. Now Frank Morales is going to start talking about gentrification.
For social control and other kinds of intent, particularly if we go back and look at the Kerner Commission's analysis of how to deal with insurgency in the urban centers. They move people out, they disperse populations, so on.
Well, how can you manipulate gentrification? I mean, what are some tactics that maybe that commission talked about?
Well, some of the ways in which neighborhoods are destroyed are through. Well, people are familiar with arson for profit. People burn things up. But the more invisible ways are, for instance, disinvestment strategies, so-called redlining. For instance, when I was living in the South Bronx in the late 70s, we went to our local city core, which was, located in the neighborhood, in the South Bronx, in the business section. In the street, and we inquired where their loans had gone during the past year. This is in 1979, I think it was 78, and they had issued, I think, 150 loans that year, and all the loans, every one, were to businesses and individuals in Westchester County. In other words, for people who aren't familiar with New York, the South Bronx is the South Bronx. Westchester County is about an hour and a half north.
Right.
And you're talking, it's very upper class, and
right.
it's a suburb, et cetera, et cetera. So this process where banks and others participate in massive disinvestment, they pull out the funds so that small homeowners can't refinance their mortgages, and so on. So you have that aspect. You have the cutback in sanitation. You have the cutback in fire service, and this is all demonstrable. You can see, you can look at this, where fire houses are closed in certain neighborhoods. It increases the fire response time, so that whole neighborhoods become subject to this kind of attack, which is kind of a synergy of effects that basically lead to a process of displacement and destruction, and a kind of what Robert Wallace, who's done a lot of interesting work on this subject, called desertification. It's kind of, you turn it into a desert. And that creates a process where then the land is consolidated, kind of brokered over to more well-to-do financial people, and you create a process of gentrification. Gentrification being the way in which the land that it formerly was the land upon which poor and working class people lived on is consolidated. But it's one thing to displace the people. It's another thing to consolidate a hold on that land, particularly if there's a lot of abandonment and people, take it among themselves, which we did to a small degree, and reoccupy those buildings and try to, organize them as homesteads and squats and so on. But the gentry, so to speak, are kind of the shock troops which follow the displacement in order to create new investment possibilities and so forth. You hear often of artists.
What Frank Morales is explaining it here is, for example, first they drive out the unwanted people, right? From a neighborhood, that they'll drive out the unwanted people by making it impossible for them to live there anymore, either by hiking rents or by defunding public services or whatever. And then once those people are gone, once they manage to remove the people, make the people leave, then they take over the infrastructure and they reconstruct it for a more upper class population, right? So that's what Frank Morales is talking about. That's how gentrification works. the process of gentrification. It's a very interesting concept. Yeah. So yeah.
Being brought in because they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of, grit,
Right.
and they become the front edge of that, and then they're displaced, and it's kind of like one of those little graphics of the big fish eating the bigger fish eating the bigger fish kind of thing, and that's what happens. And so this process of, we saw the process of displacement and understand the process of displacement as not simply the result of economic motives, but looking at the Kerner Commission and looking at some of the ideas that put forth by some of the less visible forces in terms of real estate and so forth, this notion of dispersing populations in order to control them, in order to create populations that are not only disorganized but disenfranchised in terms of voting. There are various, and these notions are set forth in these places.
The Swedish state has succeeded in doing that with undocumented immigrants, stateless persons, and refugee asylum seekers. I mean, these populations that are being targeted for removal are not organized, right? They're not organized, they're atomized. They're more concerned with day-to-day survival than with, resisting a system that wants to remove them. So, yeah. So, and of course, these people don't vote, right? They don't have representation in the parliament. The Swedish Democrats, the Swedish racists have representation in the parliament in the form of the Swedish Democrats. But of course, undocumented persons, stateless persons, and refugee asylum seekers don't have representation in the parliament, so they couldn't defend themselves in the forum of parliamentary cretinism, the same way that Swedish Democrats can. So, and yeah, I do give credit what credit is due. The Green Party has done some effort to stand up to the Swedish Democrats and defend immigrants, but immigrants themselves, the concerned immigrant populations that are being rounded up and removed, couldn't do that by themselves because they are not allowed in the parliament, right? So they couldn't defend themselves in the parliament. So yeah, so that's what Frank Morales is talking about. But in the United States, it's more like homeless people, right? Homeless people, populations that are low income, and they need to be removed from an area so that area can be gentrified, and the value of the real estate can go up or whatever. So yeah.
Heretofore were referred to as, hobos and people who traveled on trains.
I think I went ahead. Yeah.
Rambling, but I think that what New Orleans represents in some degree is that kind of displacement, and I think you could point to various evidence around that.
Yeah, that's the way it looks like to me, and FEMA's role in the short aftermath. We're at a month almost now of it being there, and just in the days immediately after, you could just to one after the other, you just hear stories, reports about FEMA's callousness and refusal to bring aid and support to the residents, and then using heavily militaristic tactics. But it all seems like part of that's just the modus operandi.
Yeah,
that's what they do.
They've New Orleans is a convergence of these various tendencies that fall within the general heading of kind of a militarization of the police, a more which is tied to a form of counterinsurgency directed against social justice movements. And when I say counterinsurgency, I mean, and from a military point of view, I mean the increased utilization of so-called non-lethal weapons, for example, at protests. We saw what happened in Miami and Seattle and these other places. This is a militarization of police response to dissent. That tendency comes together with the ongoing counter-terrorist emphasis, which sees oil, for example, in the Louisiana Louisiana offshore oil port, or loop, which sees that oil, which is strategic. That port, for instance, is the only port that handles super tankers.
Right.
I think we already went through this. Let me fast forward a little bit. Okay.
Brought in because they're willing to tolerate a certain amount of, risk.
We already did this. Let's see.
All the restrictions on the military in terms of its ability to function as law enforcement within America, in order to facilitate, they're doing a better job during these catastrophes. I mean, the unspoken here is that these catastrophes, this particular catastrophe, one of its major features was massive looting and kind of a morphing of New Orleans into LA.
Right.
And as we've seen, this is totally a lie. One of the big myths of what took place in New Orleans is the fact that there was, this massive looting and gunshots and rapes and people doing all kinds of outrageous things at the convention centers and so on. It's very clear now. There've been some reports in the last 3-4 days now. None of this was true. Very little of it. I mean, they're hard pressed to literally find, one person that fired one shot at anybody, where the guard or anybody was, had to respond and so on and so forth. This buildup was clearly about, evicting those people who might have still been, wanting to hold on to their homes.
Exactly.
I mean, all we saw was, if there was the kind of looting and so on, general uprising or mayhem, whatever your point of view is going on, that would be one thing.
Right.
But we're talking flooding here.
Right.
We're talking we're not looking at that kind of scenario. So what is it with all these troops? Well, in part, it was to accomplish a military mission, which had, from my perspective, to do with displacement and locking it down and consolidating hold on this bit of this chunk of real estate in order to achieve other kinds of agendas. But on another level, it's also now being used to rationalize the repeal of the Posse Comitatus Act. Because in the last few days, the Times had a piece the other day, Congress looking at, making it easier for military to involve itself in disasters. I mean, this type of approach. And they're talking now about, through congressional legislation, there are already a couple of bills to create more exceptions to Posse Comitatus, looking to repeal the one criminal statute, namely the Posse Comitatus Act.
Maybe give a quick little history of that act.
Okay, well, the Posse Comitatus Act was passed in 1878, and it's a criminal statute that's very short, and basically it says something to the effect that it will be, a criminal offense for the military to act as law enforcement, to execute the laws. And it basically substantiates a tradition which goes back to the founding of the Republic, which seeks to keep separate the military from the civilian. That the police function is part of a civilian function. The police are trained to deal with the question of criminals who break laws, and then the upholding of the civil liberties of people in the context of law enforcement and so forth. Not to be confused with the military, whose job it is to, extinguish and destroy things and places in the context of war making. The Posse Comitatus Act, passed in 1878, at a time when federal troops were being deployed around the country in various situations, to limit, to outlaw the involvement of active military forces within a law enforcement context, so that, practically speaking, the military, as we talk now, are not allowed to arrest and detain citizens. That is a contradiction to.
It would be very easy for the state, for the government to just give the military the power to do that. I mean, in a situation of mass insurrection, let's say that there's a massive insurrection, or like a mass strike movement, you know, like I've said in other videos talking about what would a revolution look like in Sweden, like if it would be like a massive wave of, wildcat strikes out of the control of the Social Democrat uh, labor bureaucrats, and massive demonstrations that overwhelm the police. At that point, the state will order the military in the streets. And I'm sure the military would have the right to arrest people. So, yeah, even if they have a statute that says the military cannot arrest people, when push comes to shove, in order to defend the state, you have to give the military that power at some point. That's what I would think.
A statute like the Posse Comitatus statute, which is the only criminal statute that sort of relates to this whole question. For a number of years now, at least 2-3 years, the Bush administration has had a quote-unquote review of Posse Comitatus. They've been undergoing this review process with an eye towards its repeal. I can cite you, anywhere upwards of 100 separate studies, papers and documents and so forth within the Pentagon and other places like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Center for Strategic and International Studies and other Heritage Foundation, all these places, saying that the thing is outdated. So what we're seeing now in terms of the aftermath of Katrina is to use the catastrophe of Katrina to try and convince the American public that this law is a restriction and hinders the Pentagon in its benevolent role of bringing aid and succor to the people who are undergoing these conditions. Now, we saw that is not what took place in New Orleans. They were not primarily about that. Yeah, there were sectors of the Pentagon, of the military, that were involved in bringing supplies and water and so on and so forth. But the primary mode was to do as the Army Times pointed out. The Army Times, it's a periodical published by the U.S. Army. Their cover story was entitled "Combat Operations in New Orleans," and refers to the situation in New Orleans as an insurgency. And one of the soldiers is quoted as saying, "We're going to make this place look like Little Somalia." I mean, the orientation of the soldiers, the rules of engagement. These are the regulations that govern, how much and what ammunition and what type of weaponry they're to bring into New Orleans and so forth and so on. The rules of engagement in New Orleans, just from a cursory point of view, far exceed the rules of engagement even set forth in their own civil disturbance manuals. So if you look, for instance, at Gardenplot regulations and protocols, which you can look at by going to the Center for Law and Military Operations and looking up their domestic operations manual, which lays out a whole bunch of stuff about Gardenplot in there. Gardenplot being the Pentagon Civil Disturbance Plan. Even the rules of engagement in there, particularly after LA, when a lot of the guards guys were just shooting at anything that moved, they became more restrictive.
They're talking about the Los Angeles Riots in the early 1990s, and it was an African American man who was beaten up by police, I think, and then the African American population of Los Angeles rose up in a rebellion, and they had to call in the military. So that's what they're talking about, LA.
Because they're afraid of public relations fallout as a result of these trigger-happy guards guys. So what's happened in New Orleans so forth, it's on the face of it, far exceeded what's extra legal, even from the point of view of Gardenplot. So it's very clear that what has gone on there is not, any by any stretch of the imagination about the Pentagon coming to the aid of, people facing a natural disaster in ways that make sense. This was coming to the aid of people, by pointing a rifle at them and having them leave their homes, even if their homes weren't affected by the flood. As took place in various places where evacuations, in Algiers, for instance, I hear now that people are getting back in there, that weren't affected by it. These floating of martial law. The first few days there was a martial law designation, then it was rescinded. The Pentagon, in its own manuals, U.S. Army Field Manual 19-15, for instance, which deals with civil disturbance, talks about martial rule as distinct from martial law, which martial rule doesn't need to be declared. Even the wristbands that they were apparently giving the people as they left the Astrodome and were loaded up into these buses and so forth, mimic the kinds of wristbands that are suggested in U.S. Army Field Manual 19-15 in terms of dealing with these detainees following a civil disturbance. They went in there with that mindset, and now we're looking at in a kind of it's outrageous that they would try and sneak this through at this point, but they're trying it to repeal the posse comitatus. So I would look for, over the next week or two or three, for various congressional hobnobbing and discoursing and the media reports on the fact that we need to get rid of this. It's tying the hands of the which we've heard before in terms of the Patriot Act and so on. It's going to be the same rap. Only this time the stakes are even higher, because by equating the role and function of the police and the military, if anything, what we've done is to identify with a long history of military dictatorships around the world, which have had as their primary characteristic an identification of the police and the military. It's one of the telltale signs of a military dictatorship that you don't delineate clear and separate functions for the police and the law enforcement sector as separate and distinct from the war-making sector. And by identifying the two, not only do we move towards that in a kind of general way, but specifically allows for the arrest and detention and search and seizure by troops domestically. And
and that is called they wouldn't call it maintaining law and order, because the military is not tasked with that. But if they were to impose martial rule or martial law, then at that point the military has the power to basically govern. So so I mean, all these laws or whatever, just because there is a law in the book that says that the military and police functions have to be kept separate, when push comes to shove, in order to defend the state, you got to do what you got to do, and that means that the government will order the military and give them powers to set up a martial law situation. So I mean, just because there is some law that says that you can't do that or whatever, they'll do it anyways.
I think that's what the danger is at this point, and I think it's important that people intervene into this and call for there's a lot of things to call for, but this is, I think, very important in terms of the ability of our movements, to progress in the face of this kind of repression, a reaffirmation of posse comitatus like statutes. In other words, to keep the military separate from domestic law enforcement, because to do so would I do believe endanger us all. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing that's being carried.
I agree. I see where Frank Morales is coming here, but I don't agree with Frank Morales in that he relies too much on law. Like, he thinks just because there's a law in the books that they're gonna follow it. Okay, a law can say law is just words ultimately, because as Karl, and this is where I defer to the dissident Marxists, as far as Karl Marx defined the state as bodies of armed men. Okay, bodies of armed men. That's what it boils down to. Okay, the bureaucrats, the political class in the parliament, and the bankers, they are the ruling class, but the state itself that sustains them is bodies of armed men. So it's police and military. And when push comes to shove, if the police are overwhelmed, they'll tell the military to declare martial law. Whether the law says, whether there is a law in the book somewhere saying keep the military and the police separate, in reality, bodies of armed men need to be given the leeway they need in order to defend the state. So I think Frank Morales is a little bit naive here, that he thinks that just because there's a law in the books, that's it, you're safe. No, not really.
In the aftermath of this catastrophe.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about this, how Northcom fits into all this, and because Bush just went over there, and Northcom is it's in Colorado Springs, I believe, and it's a major it's sort of the home of the underground or the continuation of government thing that they have, where if the poop hits the fan, that's where, if a bomb goes off in Washington D.C., then there's going to be a continuation of government out of Northcom.
Northcom is basically again fitting into the same trend towards the militarization of the police and the militarization of American society. In 2002, there were I think it was 7 separate military commands. You've probably heard of Space Command and Southcom, which deals with the Southern Hemisphere, Eurocom, which deals with the European context, and various other commands that parcel up the world into various sectors, according to the Pentagon.
That's how the American empire is organized.
There has never been, in the history of this country, a domestic military command until 2002. At which point, Northcom, based in at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado, was set up following the 9/11.
Right.
Although there were plans in the works for this kind of domestic military command prior to 9/11. But that's a whole other discussion. But in any case, the Northcom is a domestic military command, which is unprecedented.
Yeah.
On the face of it, in terms of what we were just discussing, it's a violation of posse comitatus.
Right.
On the face of it, at least in terms of what lawyers refer to as the spirit of the law.
Right.
Okay, but they don't care about the spirit of the law. That's the problem with Frank Morales. He is naive. The law ultimately is just words on a piece of paper. Okay, the state are bodies of armed men defending a certain set of arrangements that benefit a specific ruling class. So to sit there and say, the Posse Comitatus Act or an equivalent or whatever, doing this and that violates the spirit of the law. Of course, they're going to violate the spirit of the law. Of course, because the state doesn't care about the spirit of the law. The law is just window dressing. What they care is about preserving the interest of the ruling class. Whichever that ruling class might be. In Sweden is, a coalition of bankers, social democrat bureaucrats, and parliamentary cretins, the political class. So, protecting the interests of this conglomerate of people comes before the law. The law is something they throw at people who have no power, like undocumented immigrants, for example. But when it comes to defending their real interests, the law is not going to stop them. They'll do what they have to do. And that's why in the United States they have this command that he's talking about. I'm not surprised. That's the way states work, you know?
Okay, so you get a sense of what we're dealing with here. It's become, again, normalized. People see, oh, NORTHCOM, oh, okay. Well, NORTHCOM is a domestic military command whose primary function is not to intercept missiles coming from, the former Soviet Union, to use the old paranoid model, right? It's not to do any of that. It's to assist law enforcement, quote unquote.
Right.
All right? So you have now the Posse Comitatus Act, the thin veil that separates NORTHCOM, a domestic military command, which has at its beck and call the entire apparatus of the Pentagon. NORAD, the Special Operations Command, that includes Delta Force, you name it. Ralph Eberhard, who was the former head of NORAD, became the acting head of NORTHCOM when it was first set up. They now are the point persons for the military operation, to use the Army Times headline, in New Orleans. It's NORTHCOM that's ostensibly running the show by way of the Homeland Defense people within the White House. So that's what NORTHCOM is, and it's set up to assist law enforcement. And when the Pentagon uses terms like assist law enforcement, that means that they, for instance, can supply weapons and training for weapons. This we see in the whole non-lethal area.
Ridiculous ones like that sonic one.
Yeah, the acoustical device that's been being used it's been used in Iraq.
I heard it was used in New Orleans. I don't know. I just heard that. I don't know if it's. I didn't see any.
Yeah, no, I've heard that too, but it wouldn't surprise me because they deployed it here during the RNC.
Right, yeah.
So it's on the street. There's no question about it. It was here in New York. We saw it. We photographed it. I wrote a piece on it quite a while back.
Yeah, and he's referring to the RNC was in 2004, the Republican National Convention. There was like the anti-globalization movement and the anti-war movement converged on the RNC to like protest against the war or whatever, and there was like massive repression. And that's what he's talking about, this sonic weapon thing that they deployed it there. And like he said, there is photographs of it. And they were posted on indie media. I remember seeing them. The RNC. So, yeah.
That and the electromagnetic pulse weapon are not the product of science fiction or conspiracy loonies or anything like that. The electromagnetic pulse weaponry are microwave weapons, which are crowd dispersal weapons.
Right.
They're meant to target civilians and non-combatants. It's the whole non-lethal weapon discussion, but the function of non-lethal weapons is to provide what the Council on Foreign Relations put forth in their early, studies and supports for, the non-lethal weapons. It's to fill the gap between what they refer to as diplomatic table thumping and outright annihilation. that we needed a middle ground.
Jesus
but really
Christ.
what it's about is that you cannot, in terms of public relations, move into LA or Miami take Miami up against, peace protests or anti-globalization protests or whatever, with the kind of weaponry that would immediately turn the public against the Pentagon. So they needed something that was more PR friendly, but would still do the job, namely.
In Miami, they didn't care about PR. When they had the anti-globalization demonstration in Miami in 2003, they did not care about PR. The Miami Police Department moved in with a viciousness to beat up, literally physically beat up the anti-globalization demonstrators. Okay, and I remember seeing footage and stuff, and pictures and video was posted on indie media, what the media didn't show. It was called, because obviously the American media blacked out the repression, right? They like focused on like a couple of incidents where the demonstrators like defended themselves by saying that the demonstrators were being violent, when in fact it was the police beating them up, and a few demonstrators, because they got angry, tried to fight back. and then the media seized on that to say that the anti-globalization demonstrators were violent. That's how they do it. So yeah.
Intimidate, brutalize, with a kind of tactical brutality. Because none of this stuff is chance. I mean, they know exactly what these weapons do and how they, the kind of brutality they'll cause, but it's always measured. It's so that they can, there is some deniability built into it. It's insane. We know this. And, there's no such thing as the Pentagon's own policy statements, the Joint Chiefs Statement on non-lethal weapons, their policy directive, I think it's 3003, 3003, I think it is the directive on non-lethal weapons, states from the very beginning that non-lethal weapons, non-lethality shall not be, it shouldn't be inferred that it's 100%, likely that these weapons will not cause death. I mean, I'm not putting it out correctly, but it's that sort of
right. Just because we say it's non-lethal doesn't mean it's automatically all the time non-lethal.
Exactly. That's their opening statement in the policy. You know what I mean? It's just
but it will hurt a lot.
Yeah, it's insane. But in any case, I mean, what Northcom has done is it embodies the consolidation of this strategy of war, making war against the American people in ways that are palatable through the use of non-lethal weapons with the doctrinal rationale known as operations other than war, or OTW.
Right.
The doctrinal rationalization, namely the kind of ideological or, the ideas that are floated around to justify this war making is to do precisely what Pentagon does best, which is to just contradict itself with a straight face.
Right.
It's the war is peace mentality. So they refer to civil disturbance. They refer to the operations that they carried out in New Orleans, which looks to me like a big mass eviction and the usual stuff that they would do in terms of pointing guns at people and threatening people and so on, and what they did in Miami, and how the military is interfaced with law enforcement around the country in an increasingly overt way as operations other than war.
Right. So
as not to be, to have to admit that what they're doing is making war against the American people, along with the rest of the world. But that's, in a sense, the dialectic that we here in America have to deal with now. That the militarization, the use of the military to carry out the will of the corporations, particularly the oil, the munitions, the nuclear industry,
right,
and so on and so forth, in terms of their move towards, they're kind of clumsy. I mean, who can not see anymore that what this whole game is about? This kind of tragic, violent, machinations of these bloodletting around the world in the name of big oil and securing the resources, and locking out the rest of the world, and this power grab, that the effects of that, particularly the effects of the policization of the military around the world.
And I just wanted to point out, back in the day when it was the anti-war movement, when I was involved in the anti-war movement, I guess the war in Iraq or whatever, I remember the thing was that the analysis coming out of the movement was that, domestic repression, what Frank Morales is talking about, the militarization of the police and the militarization of the police and the use of military to carry out law enforcement functions when push comes to shove is the domestic expression of the same system of repression that is occupying Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So you see what I'm saying? So the domestic sort of like aspect of this system of military repression, which is broadest in Afghanistan and in Iraq, at the time Iraq, right? This is before 2011. This is Obama pulled out in 2011, but from Iraq, and Biden just pulled out of Afghanistan like last year. This video is being recorded in 2022, but anyways, the domestic repression is analog to the military invasions. So that was the analysis coming out of the anti-war movement around the time when this interview was aired in September 2005. And I think that's what Frank Morales means.
When you come in and you bomb a city like Baghdad, and then you got to go in there and consolidate it.
Right.
Ever since Clausewitz he's talked about, well, it's one thing to go in and beat somebody over the head. It's another thing to hold it, to hold that land, to take a piece of land and then to hold it. And that requires a certain interface with the civilian population.
Right.
And that's where, insurgencies, whether it's protest and or guerrilla activity, begin to create the kind of situations that are not easily dealt with. And that's what we're seeing in Baghdad. But this move towards policing, a politicization of the Pentagon abroad, has as its mirror the militarization of the police at home.
Right.
So what we're seeing are some of the same strategies and tactics that are used to suppress protests here, for instance, through Operation Gardenplot and some of the things that are set forth in Gardenplot and in U.S. Army Field Manual 19-15 and other places in FEMA are being exported.
Right.
Now,
maybe you could sort of correlate how Operations Other Than War relates to what's known as P2OG, or the Proactive Preemptive Operations Group. It's kind of a sort of a shadowy counterintelligence group that showed up around 2002. Yeah. Yeah.
The Rumsfeld, they've had a few. They've had a number of. They've created a number of apparatus that are shielded from the public in order to carry out some of their missions. And one, we know about the Office of Special Plans in the White House, and interlocked with sectors of the Pentagon that saw fit to just manufacture intelligence on Iraq and ride roughshod over anybody and anything that was standing in their way of invading Iraq and so on. In a similar way, Rumsfeld's people created what they referred to as the Proactive Preemptive Operations Group.
Right. Sounds pretty highfalutin.
Yeah, it's proactive, and originally the Defense Science Board, which is kind of Defense Science Advisory Board, I think it's called, which is sort of an in-house Pentagon, White House, National Security Council. It's a place where these guys get together and figure out their big moves.
Right.
Was originally revealed through a report that was issued by this particular board on this group, which is known as P2OG.
Yeah, P2OG.
Proactive Preemptive Operations Group.
Right. And
the term says it all. Yeah. By proactive and preemptive operations group, what the documents spell out are the creation of a special operations kind of Delta Force, 7,500 strong soldiers, special ops sort of soldiers,
right,
who would enact what we would refer to as terrorist actions, blow things up, assassinate people,
right,
in order to, from their logic, and this is the language that's used in the documents, in order to stimulate reactions.
Right.
All right, that's the phrase they use on the part of, the bad guys.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised about any of this. And that was back in 2002. Imagine now in 2022, 20 years later, what this P2OG has grown into. God knows, you know.
So that the bad guys will then react. So we go blow up, the hometown of somebody in order to stimulate a reaction. Well, the notion of doing terrorist actions in order to achieve a political goal has a long history.
In other words, you blow something up, you set up a group of people like a black op, you set up like a black commando to blow something up, and that provokes a reaction from some insurgent group or what have you, and then you use the excuse of that reaction in order to then engage in a massive crackdown. That's what Frank Morales is talking about.
Operation Gladio, which was an operation that was concocted by U.S. and NATO elements going way back to the post-Second World War period, blew things up in Italy and in other parts of Europe, Western Europe, in order to point the finger and demonize the communists.
Right.
In the late 40s, because this was, part of the ongoing
propaganda
hot war moving into Cold War period.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the U.S. government was in the process of shepherding the entire Nazi Eastern apparatus, the Eastern Front through Reinhard Gehlen, into Washington at the time, which is actually much more telling as far as the move from the hot war into the Cold War.
Yeah.
The kind of Nazification of the national security apparatus, from 1945, 1946, that period during this Alan Dulles and company setting this thing up. But in any case, Operation Gladio at that same period, maybe concocted by some of these very same elements, utilized these terrorist actions to achieve a political goal. Well, the T in Rumsfeld's more recent.
Okay, I have to stop the video here because I'm reading the gigabyte limit, and I'll come back in the video.